Well, I think that's the key active insight, you see, to become aware of the assumption, which frees the mind to be open, right? You see, that beyond that, you see, if you're not stuck in a rigid assumption, then your mind is free to move wherever it needs to move, right?
If you're living in a particular culture and everyone shares the same assumptions, how do you even know that they're assumptions?
Well, that's the question. You see, take Newton. There already was evidence, you see, that these assumptions were false, right? But the mind has a sort of a rigidity, so it doesn't want, it puts that in one compartment, the evidence of the falseness of the assumptions, right, of physics. And in the other compartment, it just goes on with its old habit, you see. So there are two compartments in the mind. You see, that's the way people were working, right? They were not allowing, there was concealment because one compartment was not allowed to know what was in the other compartment.
Are there any tricks that we can use to find out what our assumptions are? And
well, I think it's the other way around. We have to discover the tricks by which we fail to see what our assumptions are. It's through tricks that we fail to see this.
What tricks do we use?
Well, I'm trying to, we must discover them, you see, but there are obviously tricks. You see, somehow there must be a trick which allows a certain fact to be in one compartment, a related fact to be in another, and they never meet.
I was proposing that maybe that could be one of our questions. Is what tricks?
Yeah, what are our tricks to prevent the seeing of assumptions?
It would seem that our daily life is connected with that, at the points of challenges and points of tension that come up every day. But I think this is where people are hooked on the assumptions, and unless one yields to those points of tensions and conflicts, nothing is seen.
Yes, but you see, when there is tension, then there is tricks to... You see, there should have been tension in scientists' minds when they said heavenly matter and earthly matter are different, and also, but they are not different, right? That should have produced a state of tension, a healthy tension, right? But it didn't. You see, that was part of the trick, how you get rid of tension, which you ought to have, right?
Oh, I didn't mean in the... I meant challenge.
Yeah, but that was a challenge. See, why didn't people see that as a challenge? See, it took Newton to see that it was a challenge. You see, now, see, the point is that the mind avoids challenges by various tricks.
When you speak of the mind,
What?
when you speak of the mind, is this including the brain and the ego, or what? I guess I'm not clear.
Well, I'm just using it in the colloquial sense, the way people always use it. You see, I'm not trying to be very technical or anything. It should include the brain or whatever else, you know, whatever you want to call it. That what we call the mind is whatever it is that is thinking and perceiving and so on, right? We don't know. I'm not going to make at this stage try to say anything more. Right?
If you see how quickly everybody jumped on the bandwagon that the moon was falling, like the apple, what you said, that his insight was in something that was real, gives you kind of a feeling of, if any of us could see, have the big insight, what was real. I mean, we could, all this would then be, would this be as false as thinking the moon was going to stay up there? I mean, and we're all busy being at the point where we think the moon is going to stay up there.
Well, yes, I think, you see, the point is, where our problem is this, that we are at the point where we have evidence that the moon, we believe the moon will stay up there, and we have evidence that it will not, right? Right. That's what's happened with the ego. We said, everybody wants insight, but they said, but really, also at the same time, nobody wants it. Right? That should be a tremendous challenge, right? But people generally feel quite comfortable despite that, right? That is, see, such a challenge should make a person extremely uncomfortable, but the mind has various tricks by which it does not become uncomfortable.
Well, it's not the ego that's having the insight, and therefore perhaps it feels it's losing control.
What?
Well, the ego likes to feel that it's in control of everything. All right, the ego is not that which has the insight. and therefore perhaps it fears the insights because it thinks it's losing control.
Well, perhaps so, but somehow, but then you're saying that the ego is in control, so how can insight do anything? You see, what you say implies that the ego is the one who is in control.
No, I mean, it likes to believe that it is and feel that it is and is unhappy when it isn't.
Well, what kind of a being is that likes to feel that it is when it isn't? And
that's the ego.
but I mean, it's not making sense. You see,
It isn't.
I'm saying it, but you see, our language is accepting things that don't make sense. You see, we can't proceed from there. You see, we have to question it. You see, saying somewhere in that very statement, it's like saying, the moon stays up in the sky where it belongs, but of course we all know that the moon is not different from earthly matter, right? You see that there's a kind of contradiction there, which the mind, see that the interesting point is, how does the mind remain comfortable with a contradiction? Whereas, you see, if you really see a contradiction, you do not remain comfortable, right? So something very strange is going on. You see, the ego finds tricks by which it remains comfortable when there is a contradiction, you see, which seems crazy, right? So if you said, is the ego crazy?
I think that ties into this lady's statements about intensity also, because as long as the ego can maintain itself comfortable, intensity won't be there.
Yeah, but it seems that the ego, the notion that the ego must remain comfortable takes precedence over everything else, including even the life of the individual or the society, or even things which will actually make the ego very uncomfortable, right? I say, so if we say we must remain comfortable and not disturb ourselves about whether, what's happening with nuclear war, the destruction of the environment, but sooner or later something will happen which will make us very uncomfortable. But you see, the ego seems to say, well, we won't worry about that until it happens, right?
And
but
when that does happen, often it just tries to get comfortable again as soon as it can.
Yeah, but it seems that this very search of the ego for comfort is the source of the crisis, which makes it uncomfortable, you see. You see, there seems to be a contradiction going on again.
Did Newton's ego ask the question?
Well, I don't know. You see, perhaps not. You see, perhaps something else asked the question, right?
But Newton's was much more peripheral, even though you can say that the assumptions that they had about heavenly matter and earthly matter gave him and his culture a certain security. It still wasn't the fundamental insight.
No, but he himself said so when he was dying, right?
Right. So for him, it was much less threatening to contemplate the moon falling and yet never hitting the earth than it is to deal with that ultimate problem of
well, that's why he didn't do it, right? But you see, when he was dying, he said, I'm going to die anyway. I have the ultimate threat, so this.
Can't get away from it.
Then you see, while he was young, the ego projects an infinite life, right? Saying, I'm going to live forever, right? But knowing that you won't, right? Again, a contradiction, right?
It seems to me that the question of absolute necessity needs to be raised here. If we could question why thought thinks it's absolutely necessary, why the ego hides behind this assumption that this comfort zone and this ego has to be maintained. And I think in order to do that, we have to look at what does it mean to say I am.
Yes, what is it? Well, the ego says I am, right? And that's a thing we could discuss. I think, I don't know how much further we should go this evening. But that may be an assumption, right? It says not only I am, but I must be, I have to be, right? With absolute necessity. And therefore, and somehow it gets disturbed when there's evidence that it won't be, right? And in fact, there's always evidence, right?
I'd like to get back to this question of people thinking about certain things at the moment of death, because after all, death is kind of the ultimate insult to the ego. It's constantly contriving ways of being invulnerable, and if it sees a deficiency, it invents something to protect itself against that. But when it comes up to the moment of death, there's no escape, there's no exit. And, it makes me think of, and then you had mentioned the fact that people come up with new ideas when they give up, when they're able to abandon old preconceived notions. Now the ego, it wants to have this notion of immortality, and it's confronted with death, and it knows that it's not going to happen. It kind of reminds me of the story of Gertrude Stein on her deathbed, saying, "What is the answer? What is the answer?" And I think it was Alice B. Toklas who was with her, said, "Well, what is the question?" And that brings up the issue is, does every answer have a question? There was, we're just kind of turning the thing around, we assume that every question that we ask about limited things like Newton's question about why the moon doesn't fall, usually has an answer, and he came up with an answer. But there may be answers that we seek, which there really is no question. We just believe that there is a way of asking a question that will give that answer.
Well, if there is one, then we must ask why does the mind engage in such an irrational procedure? You see, it comes to the same point again, that whatever we call the ego seems to maintain itself, it seems to live almost entirely by engaging in various forms of irrationality and insanity, and yet it seems to be the most important thing in our lives, you see, and yet if you try to look for it, you can't find it, right? So the whole thing, the point I would like to leave you with and to sort of consider, is what is going on here? You see, what is this crazy thing going on that people have got used to, and they're taking it everybody has got used to taking it for granted, right? And so that we have the assumption that however crazy it is, we're stuck with it. And we must somehow adjust to it, right? And somehow make the best of it, right? So therefore, can we begin to question that assumption, saying that maybe it isn't necessary to be stuck with it, right? But if not, then we have to begin to inquire, to find the right questions to inquire into what is it. See, every question has assumptions in it, and sometimes the question has in it the very assumption that has to be questioned. So when you make a question about the ego, that's what often happens. That is, you make a question: why does the ego do this? Why does it do that? And so on. You see, but it has in it the assumption that the ego is an entity. You see. But maybe it isn't.
Lots of that.
Right.
That happens all over the place. In other words, space used to be full of ether because it had to be full of something. And so they had trouble getting rid of that, although we do this all the time. In the old days, they had gnomes and pixies and fairies and things because these were all unanswered questions. We didn't know what was going on, so we hung a name on it. We created an entity. Maybe the ego is just another created entity.
Well, it may be. You see, on the other hand, it looks remarkably real in its effects, right? So, therefore, it's not such an easy question to go into, you see, to say that this very powerful thing, to say that it isn't. Well, we have to understand how in the world can it exert such power when there's nothing there.
got it.
You still got all that power and all those effects, you see.
And maybe we take for granted that we understand what ego is, and we talk about this almost every day. But I don't think we really understand. There is no, we don't understand what ego is. Maybe the question we go and the inquiring in that ego. What is that ego? What is associated with the ego?
Yes, that's the question. What is the ego? But that may contain an assumption that there is an ego.
Well, let's put the question, is there an ego or it is not?
Maybe there isn't an ego, you see. We say maybe there is, maybe there isn't, right?
Yes, but we start with the same question. Is it an ego or it isn't? We keep just repeating the word.
No, I'm changing the question, which is if there isn't an ego, why should all the effects of the ego be present?
Yes, but once we start just inquiring that,
What?
that really can help us, can reveal, can help us to understand. It means we are sincerely interested to understand what is the ego, or if there is ego. Otherwise, we wouldn't bother to care to go into the inquiring of this subject.
Yes, I'm not sure I quite get your point, but what I wanted to say was that I think that people here are beginning to feel that it's an interesting question to say, we don't know, is there an ego, there's not an ego, but if there's not an ego, why should we have ever thought there was one, you see, because it has a very powerful, there still is all the power of the effects which we have been ascribing or attributing to the ego, which we must understand.
If we agree to call something real, it's real. I mean, is it deeper? There's a reality to an ego because it makes us jump. But is there truth to the ego? Is that what you mean?
Well, maybe, but then we have a wrong notion of whatever is going on, right? You see, something is going on, something real, but if we say that which is going on indicates that it's coming from the ego, that's one explanation, right? One assumption. But maybe it comes from something else, which we call thought.
I'm not sure. Are you also maybe saying in some way that if I ask a question like, why is the ego so, powerful, that already when I'm asking that question, that there's an assumption in there that is somehow that the question has the assumption in it. Oh man, I had this before I opened my mouth.
The ego exists.
Yeah, but right, that very question itself has the problem in it.
Yeah, because it assumes the ego exists, right?
And that almost everything you're doing in your attempts to do something about the ego all have that assumption in it.
Yeah.
And so you miss it all the time.
Yes. You see, I'll give you an example. Suppose you are walking in, you see a shadow, something, a dark region, a dark night, and you assume that it's somebody, an assailant, right? And then your whole body is stirred up, the blood, the adrenaline, and everything, right? And therefore you say, what do I do about that assailant? You say, should I fight him? Should I run? You see, but you may then make all sorts of questions about the assailant. What is his religion? You see? And so on. But you see, once you see that it's a shadow, you see that it's really quite a different problem.
It seems it even requires an insight for you to ask, is there an ego? Since we live with ego as our basic structure, more or less.
Yes, one sees already, the reason I'm asking it is, I say, here is this entity which has such contradictory properties. Now, in any other scientific field where I encounter that much contradiction, I would suspect that the thing is not, that assumption is not true at all, right? Yeah, but here somehow we don't do that, you see. So I'm saying maybe it's not true. I'm not saying yes or no.
Maybe Descartes had an insight when he said, "I think, therefore I am."
But I don't think he meant it in that sense, you see.
But after well, I went through 3 stages on this thing. This is silly, and then I thought, oh, maybe, and then the last thing was he was right. The ego is produced by thought.
Yes, I don't know that he meant it that way, but
he did, but he was right.
but he meant that the thought was the essential quality of the ego, right?
Yeah, more like I think, therefore I am what I think I am.
No, he wasn't using it as a proof that he exists, but he really meant that thinking was the essential quality of the ego, right?
That's what I meant. That I think I am what I think I am.
No, he was saying the fact that any being which is must have some basic activity or quality, right? So he's saying that the ego, its basic quality is the ability to think, right? That's what he's saying. Now, some people don't agree with. Some people say the basic quality of the ego is to feel emotions, and other people say the basic quality of the ego is in the body to feel powerful. To be in. There's 3 kinds of people, you see. Some of them emphasize thought, intellectuals. Some of them emphasize the emotions, and some emphasize the physical, right? So some people say the main thing that makes me really feel that I am is when I can do something, right? Another fellow says, I am because I can have feelings. Another fellow says, I am because I can think. You see, clearly Descartes was an intellectual, right?
But even the ones that say, I am because I can think, isn't thought that going with certain amount of emotions?
Well, yeah, he'll agree.
It's not right.
He wouldn't say he has no emotions, but he says the main thing that makes him feel it and think my main being is that I can think. That's what he was saying. Somebody else would say my main being is in feeling. Somebody else would say my main being is in physical movement, right?
But these are a lot of assumptions. We've been raised on this Freudian ego, and we've had that jargon with us for a long time, but never really looked at it.
Yeah, well, these are all assumptions as to what I am, right? So you say, I am, we'll discuss that. What is the meaning of the word I am, right?
I think it precedes Freud. I happen to have grown up bilingually, and the word ego comes from the Greek ego, which means I. I mean, so when I grew up, the words were interchangeable. I was always there. I knew nothing about Freud.
Yeah, well, I mean, the notion of the self was an ancient notion, clearly, but Freud said some things about it, but he tended to reify it in the way he put it, right? To make it a thing, right? But
to be analyzed.
Yeah, to be analyzed. Now, there are different notions of the self. You see, Descartes' notion was one notion, right? Freud had another one, which is not all that different from Descartes. And but then perhaps we'll discuss that tomorrow. What could be meant by the word I am, you see. And the power of that concept, right?
Shall we leave it at that? Shall we leave it at that?
Yes, I think that it's very nearly, we've been here for an hour and a half. It's getting late now.